Black Myth Wukong is one of the most highly anticipated game launches of the year, and with the launch set for the 20th of August, the developer has made a bold move to release a benchmark tool ahead of time so that potential players can see if their system is up for the task. So in typical eTeknix fashion, we spent the last week testing it on as many graphics cards as possible at 3 resolutions, 5 presets, and some full ray tracing and upscaling tests thrown in for good measure, so you can get an idea as to if your system will be able to run the game when it releases. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
Okay, so before we jump into the monumental array of charts that we have and sift through the data, let's talk about the actual game. While no one outside of industry insiders have actually played the game, it's started to have a bit of an upward trend since its announcement, as I guess has prided itself on delivering the very best graphics and visuals thanks to its development on Unreal Engine 5 and supporting full ray tracing and increasing visual fidelity thanks to lighting, reflections and shadows. For some context, just the benchmark tool alone, which is what we've been using ourselves to test truckloads of graphics cards, has already seen over 3,600 reviews, giving it a very positive outcome. Not bad for a benchmark tool, so I'm expecting good things from the game itself when that launches. Beyond that, I'm not a game reviewer, so I won't pretend or tell you my thoughts of what to expect from the game, apart from at least on the visual aspect side of things, and of course, what you probably came here for, performance. Before we get into that though, let's talk about the settings. Though I have no confirmation, I'd like to think that, well, no drastic changes will happen between what we see in the benchmark tool and of course then the final release of the game, which as I mentioned is coming out on the 20th of August. The settings menu is pretty simple and is broken up between display and graphics, and there really isn't a huge amount of settings. In the display menu, you have the opportunity to change display mode from borderless to windowed, change the aspect ratio, resolution, set a frame cap of 30, 60, 120 FPS or off, enable or disable VSync, and adjust the motion blur intensity because, well, some people just hate that. In the graphics menu, there's, I guess, a bit more going on. Firstly, you can let the game decide as to what graphics settings should actually be set, or you can just dial things in manually yourself. This involves adjusting super resolution, changing the sampling technology between TSR, ZES, DLSS and FSR if your card supports them, and then for everything apart from ZES or ZSS, you have the option for frame generation. As the game is made in conjunction with Nvidia, of course there's a big focus on ray tracing, and it gives you the option for full ray tracing, as the game actually has ray tracing turned on as standard, but this setting is more for those who want to experience path tracing and the like. And then you get the option for which level of full ray tracing you actually want. Beyond that, you have your graphics preset, which ranges from low, medium, high, very high, and even cinematic. And we've tested all of them to show the difference in performance between them. Obviously, beyond the presets, you can then adjust the individual quality of effects, shadows, global illumination, reflections, and so on. Now, when it comes to upscaling, you technically can't turn it off as such, and instead can change the slider from between 25 to 100, which technically 100 means that you're at 100% scaling of the resolution. So I guess you could say that it's off, but in all honesty, seeing that, it may just confuse some people ever so slightly. Now, one niggly thing that I noticed with the resolution or the scaling part of it, it kind of happened sadly after I spent a couple of hours testing, and that was that when you increase the resolution on the display page, the super resolution scale automatically adjusts down as you go up to 1440p or 4K, for instance. Now, we have actually seen similar, let's call them features, like this in other games, so it's no surprise, but still a bit of an annoyance nonetheless, especially when I spent, like I mentioned, a couple of hours testing some cards and then realising that the results just didn't line up because of this. Now, before we get into the data, let's take a look at the quality presets and what it actually means in terms of visuals. Even on lower settings, players using older hardware can still enjoy a smooth and visually appealing experience. However, switching to the medium preset significantly enhances the visuals. Lighting becomes more realistic with deeper shadows and richer reflections, particularly noticeable in dynamic elements like running water. Textures also see a boost, giving objects like rocks a more pronounced three-dimensional quality, but depending on your GPU, you may suffer in the performance side of things in favour of getting those visuals. Applying the high preset amplifies these improvements further, especially in distant elements. The environment feels more detailed, with far-off objects like trees rendered with greater clarity and precision, adding depth to the landscape overall. The balance between performance and visual quality at this setting will appeal to the vast majority of gamers, though you may need to use upscaling to boost that performance to a more reasonable level. Next, the very high setting offers a modest enhancement over the high setting, but presents a stark improvement compared to low and medium. Shadows and highlights exhibit greater contrast, while distant details are rendered with remarkable sharpness. The world feels that little bit more vibrant and immersive, but the cost in frames per second may not be worth the negligible improvement unless you're willing to use upscaling or frame generation, of course, if your GPU supports it. Finally, the cinematic preset delivers a breathtaking visual experience. Shadows and highlights reach their peak contrast, and every detail near or far is rendered with extraordinary precision. However, this level of fidelity comes at a cost, demanding significantly more from your hardware. For those with powerful systems, it offers the most immersive and lifelike experience, perfectly capturing the realism of Wukong's ancient China forest setting. But you'll see exactly what that means for your GPU because, well, it's a pretty demanding game to give you that level of visual fidelity. So with the visuals out the way, let's get into the real reason that you're here, to see how various graphics cards do at various resolutions and presets. Now, I will warn you that there's, well, a lot of data to go through, as we've spent the best part of a week running each test, taking close to about 2 hours per GPU, and that's not including retests. Luckily, the testing, apart from taking a while, did go relatively smoothly, aside from the niggly thing with the super resolution changing when we first started testing. But beyond that, things all went to plan. For our testing, we used our GPU test system with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 DDR5 memory. For the motherboard, we used the Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with the latest BIOS version installed, along with Windows 11 on its latest update. Driver-wise, we used AMD, Intel and Nvidia's latest drivers, and we tested, well, quite a few cards in total, so bear with us, including all the cards from the latest generations from AMD, Intel and Nvidia, as well as some older cards to see how they'd hold up. For the scaler, we decided to use TSR to fairly be able to compare AMD, Intel and Nvidia cards against each other without utilising their respective technologies like DLSS, FSR and ZSS. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with 1080p on the low preset, and it's here where most cards actually did okay from both AMD and Nvidia, with the top end 4090 giving us 212 FPS overall. AMD's top tier 7900 XTX fell 6% behind at 200 FPS, but that's still more than enough for this type of game, though this may drop in the more intensive scenes when actually playing the game, in fight scenes for instance. Beyond that, the performance trickles down, but we still see strong performance from the likes of the RTX 4068 GB at 85 frames per second, which is essentially on par with the RX 7600 from AMD at 84 FPS. In terms of Intel, the A717 narrowly surpasses 60 FPS, while the A750 sits just 1 FPS below it. And while the A580 comes in at 54 FPS, I fear that higher resolutions or presets will see that drop pretty rapidly. As we move up to 1440p, the RTX 4090 still comes in strong at 162 frames per second, followed by the 7900 XTX, which is now sitting 11% behind. There's a bit of a mixed bag between AMD and Nvidia cards like the 6950 XT and 4070 Ti, which both come in identically in both the averages and the 1% lows. As we move down, we're still good all the way down to the trusty 3060 Ti at 62 FPS and the 2080 Super, which still puts up a fight, coming in at 56 frames per second. A lot more cards now move into the territory of still being playable, but not offering up the best experience, which, no surprise again, is the 3 ARC cards that we tested from Intel at the bottom. 4K sees the 4090 take a bigger lead in comparison to AMD's flagship by 23%, and now only 7 cards sit above 60 frames per second, with the 4070 Ti Super 2 frames above that. Older cards like the 6950 XT are still holding strong, but now some newer cards like the RTX 4070 at just 44 FPS will start to see things struggle a little bit. 30 FPS is still playable, but more intensive parts of the game could see some sizable dips in performance, and cards like the 7600 XT from AMD and RTX 4060 from Nvidia won't lead to, let me say, an enjoyable experience. Though, what's interesting is how the A770 moves up in our charts, but that's more a testament to other cards dropping down, which in turn make it look somewhat better. Back down to 1080p, but this time looking at the medium preset, and we still see some really strong performance across the board. The margin between the two flagships edged closer, with 7% separating them, and some older cards, again like the 6950 XT and also the 3090 Ti, do well above 100 frames per second, showing that they still have some life left in them. Anything from the RX 7600 and up from AMD and 4060 and up from Nvidia are still good for 60 FPS, and even the 2080 Super shows what performance it still has left in it. Again, the Intel Arc cards sit at the bottom of our stack and are still playable, but upscaling will help push things over 60 FPS, but will of course suffer in terms of the visual quality. At 1440p, we're still good for over 60 FPS on quite a few cards, including the 6950 XT again, 3080 Ti and RX 6800. There are some older cards which just fall short of 60, like the 3070 Ti, but again, upscaling would help push those numbers up. Though for cards like the RTX 3060 at 37 FPS and the Intel Arc cards at sub 36 frames per second, they may find that upscaling may just have to be a bit more aggressive to get the performance that's needed. At 4K, we're starting to see more cards slip below 60 FPS now, with only the RTX 4090, 7900 XTX and 4080 Super making the cut. You could argue that the 4080 is still up there too, as it comes in at 59 frames per second, and we do still have some hope for older cards like the RTX 3080 Ti, but if you're not a fan of upscaling, then older and lower end newer hardware are really going to start struggling, and now we have some cards hitting the teens and not offering up any form of enjoyable gameplay. At 1080p on the high preset, which is where I'd like to think most people will be playing, we have the majority of the RTX 40 series cards, like the 4070 Super and RTX 4070, doing well at 86 and 75 frames per second respectively. The 4060 Ti falls shy at 59 FPS, but again, without sounding a bit like a broken record, frame gen or even just adjusting the scaling resolution will help push this up, closer to 80 FPS. Below 60 now includes the RTX 4060 and 7600 XT 16GB, but at 1080p all cards manage to perform above 30 FPS, but that's not to say that it will feel smooth in any way. 1440p now sees the RTX 4090 slip below 100 frames per second, and the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super come in evenly matched. Other cards worth mentioning include the 3080 Ti at 61 frames per second and the RTX 4070 Super. The Super has the ability to utilise frame generation, so has a small trick up its sleeve to boost performance, but it's still nice to see an older card like the 3080 Ti holding its own. Moving down, and we have 5 cards coming in at 30 FPS or less, and while tweaking of the settings will help, there are sacrifices in visual quality that would have to be made. 4K on high takes quite a battering now, with only the RTX 4090 hitting 60 FPS. This just goes to show that the likes of the 4080 Super, 7900 XT and 4070 Ti Super, for instance, really are reliant on upscaling in this title. While older cards won't get the same treatment in terms of frame generation, so lowering the resolution or the settings themselves really will be the main point of getting performance back up to reasonable levels. 1080p on very high still shows some good performance from the 4070 Ti and up, along with both 7900 series cards, as they surpass 60 FPS. The likes of the 3080 Ti now drops to 54 FPS, and the trusty 6950 XT now drops to 53 frames per second, while a lot more cards, including the RTX 4060 and 7900 XT, which come in at 29 frames per second, don't quite make the cut at this setting and at this resolution. At 1440p, the RTX 4090 is now the only card surpassing 60, though both the 4080 and 4080 Super just dip below at 57 FPS for both, followed closely behind by the 7900 XTX. Beyond that, a lot of cards hover around the 38 to 42 FPS mark, where they essentially run out of steam. The demands of this game are really showing now, as we have newer GPUs like the RTX 4060 Ti at 27 FPS, the 7600 XT at 21 FPS, and the RX 7600 now hitting 20 frames per second and matching that of the Arc A770. Moving up to 4K, and we're now in new territory with the 4090 still leading the pack but at 45 frames per second, while the 4080 series and 7900 XTX come in evenly matched. If wanting to game at 4K and on very high, upscaling really is the only saving grace here, and something we will be looking at shortly, though things drop off quite rapidly for other cards, with lots now sitting in the 20s, like the 3080 Ti, 3080 12GB, and even the 7900 GRE. Beyond that, we now have our first cards sitting in single digits, which frankly was an awful experience to watch, let alone predicting what it would be like to actually play on. Lastly, taking a look at the top setting, which is cinematic, and at 1080p, the 4090 still comes in with a commendable 81 frames per second. Both 4080 cards and the 7900 XTX come in above 60, while the 7900 XT just falls short of the mark at 58 FPS. Lower end and older cards are still playable, like the 4070 Super, 7900 GRE and 7800 XT, though personally I'd be knocking the preset down or utilising upscaling to my advantage, while a lot of lower end cards may struggle even with upscaling enabled. At 1440p, the 4090 still clings on at 66 FPS, with every other card dropping below that threshold that most gamers crave. The likes of the 4080 series and the 7900 XTX are still within reach of making it work, while lower end 40 series, 7000 series and older cards, even with extreme levels of upscaling, are really going to feel the brunt of it. But I wouldn't be expecting gamers to play at 1440p on max settings on a card like that anyway. Then lastly, 4K cinematic just goes to show how intensive this game is. Even the RTX 4090, while putting up a fight, succumbs to its defeat at 41 frames per second. Again, being a 40 series, it does have frame gen up its sleeve, which we will be looking at, and other scaling options, but it does look like this game is ready for next gen graphics, especially when we see the huge hit that a lot of cards take in our chart, all the way down to the Intel Arc cards and RX 7600, which never really started the race in the first place. Now, I mentioned earlier in regards to full ray tracing and upscaling, including frame generation, where applicable. It's here where we took both the RTX 4090 and 7900 XTX to see what kind of uplifts we could get with upscaling and frame generation, along with enabling ray tracing in its entirety to see what effect that has, and then again seeing what levels of performance we could bring things up to again using upscaling and frame gen. What we found was the RX 7900 XTX didn't see any real uplift in performance changing from TSR to FSR, separated by just a single frame per second. Frame generation on the AMD card saw an uplift of 81%, while setting the scaling to 50% saw a bigger uplift of 88%. Combining the two led to a frame rate of 106 FPS, which gives us a whopping 231% increase in frames. So running at 4K cinematic still gives us some great looking visuals while keeping performance up. Sadly, the same can't be said for ray tracing, where no matter the situation, the 7900 XTX just falls flat on its face. With no upscaling or frame generation, we drop down to just 4 frames per second. And while the best case scenario is frame generation and 50% upscaling, that still only results in 27 frames per second. So really, your only option is to reduce the resolution or the graphics preset, or both. In terms of the RTX 4090, it's no surprise that it fares better. From its 41 FPS at native using TSR, we do see an increase when enabling DLSS of 17%, now sitting at 48 frames per second. Though frame gen helps push that further up to 77 FPS, which is another 60% more performance. Though 50% upscaling and frame gen is where you ideally want to be at 121 FPS, which is almost a 200% increase from native. Though you could tweak the upscaling level to bring that down slightly while still getting smooth gameplay. Ray tracing drops performance by almost half, now sitting at 22 FPS, and this time DLSS doesn't really do anything with a change from TSR. Frame gen brings performance back up to native levels at 41 FPS, though the most impressive result is with frame gen turned on and upscaling set to 50%, which gives us 98 frames per second for the very best visuals, upscaling aside, and good strong performance. So going into this, I had high hopes for the visual quality of the game, and it didn't disappoint. The game looks simply stunning, from the lighting and shadows down to the reflections on the water. While this is only a benchmark tool, I'd hope that it's going to be a true representation of what to expect in the game, because, well, otherwise, what's the point in releasing this tool for users to see how their current hardware will perform if it's not a true and accurate representation of what they're going to experience in-game? Obviously, time will tell as to if that is the case, but you'd like to think it is going to be. Performance-wise, I won't lie. Even if you're rocking an RTX 4090 and on anything higher than the high preset on 4K, you're going to see sub 60 FPS with the high preset hitting it right on the money. Other older and slower cards really are going to see things struggle at 4K, but honestly, above 30 FPS still manage to maintain a smooth and fluid experience. So going back through our testing data, I guess it's a decision as to if you want to go higher resolution and lower graphics preset, or the opposite and going lower resolution and a higher graphics preset. The land of diminishing returns is always going to rear its ugly head when you start cycling through graphics presets as to if bumping up the settings actually gives you more in terms of visual fidelity, or as an individual, if you just, well, can't notice the increase in visuals in comparison to the hit that you're actually going to take in terms of performance. Obviously, you do have some options. You can dial things in a little more when looking at the individual settings. And instead of using a preset as intended, you can set it and tweak things to get a balance of visual fidelity that suits you, along with the performance levels that I guess you're expecting based on the hardware that you have. Now, with a game like this, high frame rates isn't everything, as, well, it's not a competitive shooter or the like, so you can get away with sub 60, but be warned that more intensive parts of the game, I guess when it releases, may hinder your experience overall. To combat this, as mentioned, you do have upscaling, which in a game like this, much like we saw in Alan Wake 2, well, it can be a real godsend and bring levels of performance back up to the levels that you'd expect on the hardware that you've got. Like I say, this is almost kind of next generation graphics, and some cards are really going to struggle, as you saw from the results. What we have seen here today is that the game really can push the limits of modern day hardware as we prepare for the next wave of future generation graphics cards to hit the market. And that's why it's no wonder that the developers have baked ray tracing into the game as standard and give a ton of options for various upscaling technologies. Not just from AMD, Intel and Nvidia, but also in the form of TSR, which we tested. And that was developed by Epic Games as part of the Unreal Engine. It allows those who are maybe on older and varying hardware to still see what the buzz is all about without having the latest GPU on the market and spending a lot more money. Me personally, I'm looking forward to the game releasing and seeing if the reviews stay consistent with what we've seen appear on the benchmark tool. So definitely leave a comment once it launches about what you think of the game and, more importantly, if your performance lines up with what you saw here today, whether that be on an Intel graphics card, an AMD graphics card, or Nvidia. So yeah, let me know. For now, that's going to about do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you appreciate the huge, monumental amount of testing we did for this one, then you can help support everything we do over on Patreon. You'll get access to a lot of our testing data, the ability to join a super special area over on our Discord, exclusive behind the scenes content, and so much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.